Let's look at the support skills for Lesson 1, Part A. In the next class, you will need to measure different types of quantities, gather data, and make decisions from the data you collect. So welcome to the first day of class. We're going to look at this handout. So if we talk about numerical quantities, make a list of some examples from everyday life where you use numbers and values. Hopefully you can build on what we came up with in class. So what we came up in class was we use it when we're cooking. For example, we look at cups. When we're talking about distance, we can see things like feet, yards, miles, and kilometers. Someone in our class had a job in medical billing and said they see numerical values in coding, price, and quantities. And then we also came up with an example of driving where you see distance again like miles and kilometers, but you also see speed such as miles per hour. So a quantity is any characteristic of a situation that can be measured or counted. When you measure a certain quantity, you assign a numerical value to it. Different types of quantities can take on different forms. For example, volume, length, weight, etc. When you add or subtract quantities, they must be of the same type and the same unit. So you can see I have that underlined and boxed. It's very important. When you add or subtract quantities, they must be of the same type and the same unit. So if we look at number 2, you're asked to match each quantity with a measurement by connecting the lines between them. So try it on your own and then double check here for the answers. So we said water in a glass could best be measured by that 3/4 cup, that a person's height could best be measured as 5 feet and 6 inches, that the duration of a movie had a measurement of 1 hour and 49 minutes, that the water in a bathtub made sense as a measurement of 80 gallons, and that a bag of oranges made sense with a measurement of 11 servings of fruit. So the next section we're going to talk about is converting fractions to decimals. So in the previous problem, one of the given measurements was 3/4 cups, or 3/4 of a cup. Another way to express this amount is by using the decimal representation of the measurement. So you may have seen the fraction 3/4 written as a decimal before, but other decimals are far less common. So we're going to review how to convert fractions into decimals. The fraction 3/4 can also be written as 3 divided by 4. So that fraction bar in between the 3 and the 4 is just another way to write division. So if we look at a calculator, by typing 3 divided by 4 into a calculator in the same order that it's spoken, the numerator, the number up top, divided by the denominator, the number in the bottom, we can get the decimal representation of that fraction. And you can see we get that 0.75. Notice when they wrote it, they have the 0 in front of the decimal point. Our calculators won't put the 0 in front of there, but we know if there's no other number in front of that decimal point, there's really a 0 there. So sometimes mixed fractions are also used in measurements, such as 1½ cups. So one method for writing this number in its decimal representation is to first find the decimal representation for the fraction 1/2, and then add the remaining whole number to the result. So for example, to find the decimal representation of 1½ we would first do the 1 divided by 2, which gives us 0.5, and then we would add the whole number part, the 1. And if we do that, we get the 1.5. You can see I walked you through how to use your calculator here. So now we're going to use your calculator to compute the decimal representation of other fractions in the following problems. So here's just another way talking through those examples above. So we're going to convert each fraction into its decimal representation using your calculator. First, write the fraction using the division symbol, and then write the decimal form. So if we look at part A for 1/8, we wrote it as 1 divided by 8 and found that it gave us 0.125, which we can also read as 125 thousandths. If we look at part B, we had 7 divided by 8, which gives us 0.875, or 875 thousandths. If we look at part C, we have a mixed number, 1 and 1/8. So notice I rewrote it. I brought the 1 over as the whole number, and I said I needed to add that fraction part. So that fraction 1/8, I rewrote it as 1 divided by 8. So we do that division first. When we do 1 divided by 8, we get 0.125. And then when I add 1 to it, I get 1.125, or 1 and 125 thousandths. One thing I want to point out is that if you're using your graphing calculator, it will do the order of operations for you. So you can type in the whole thing as one step, 1 plus the 1 divided by 8, and still get that same final answer. So if we look at part D, where we have 2 3/4, we did the same process. We brought that whole number 2 over. We wrote that fraction 3/4 as 3 divided by 4, and we needed to add them. So we have 2 plus 3 divided by 4, which gives us that answer of 2.75, or 2 75 hundredths. So we can also use your calculator to add or subtract decimal values. This is done by typing the decimal values into your calculator, pardon me, and using the appropriate symbol, a plus or a minus, between them. For example, if you want to add the decimals 125 thousandths and 2 75 hundredths, you'll input the following into your calculator. So we'll do 0.125 plus 2.75. And if we do that, we get 2.875, or 2 875 thousandths. So if we're talking about place values and rounding, let's look at an additional example, or additional few examples that aren't in our textbook, to make sure we understand the skill that we're going to be using. So if we look at this, we have 1.27498. So when we're asked to round to a place value, we look to the right of that place. If the number to the right is 0 through 4, so 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, we leave the number alone. If it's 5 through 9, so 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, we bump it up or round up. So if we're rounding to the nearest tenth, the 2 is the number in the tenths place. The 7 is the number to the right of it. So that 7 tells us to bump the 2 up. So when we round, we'll write it as 1.3, or 1 3/10. Notice whatever place value we're rounding to is the last digit that we have. We just drop everything after it if it's after a decimal point. So if we're rounding that same number to the nearest hundredth, 7 is in the hundredths spot. The 4 is right next to the 7 on the right. So that 4 tells us to leave it alone. So we leave the 7 alone, and we'll have 1.27, or 1 27 hundredths, as our answer. If we look at rounding to the nearest thousandth, 4 is the digit in the thousandths place. 9 is to the right of it, so that 9 tells us to round up. So we're going to bump that 4 up to a 5. Remember, we keep everything before it exactly the same. So we have 1.275, or 1 275 thousandths. Now, if we look at rounding to the nearest 10,000th, this one's a little tricky. The 9 is in the 10,000 spot, so that 8 tells us to bump the 9 up. But if we bump 9 up, we get a 10. We can't put 10 in that spot for one digit, so what we do is we put the 0 there, and we carry the 1 over to the next spot. So we'll end up with 1.2750, or 1 2,750 10,000ths. So let's keep practicing. If we look at number 4 and all the other problems, our directions are, for each of the following problems, write each quantity in its decimal representation. So for number 4, we have 1/2 C, where that C is the abbreviation for cups. So I'm going to do 1 divided by 2, which gives me 0.5 or 0.5, and make sure to keep that C attached for cups. If we look at number 5, where we have 12 3/4 cups, we're going to do that 3 divided by 4 to get 0.75 and add the whole number part, the 12. So we'll end up with 12.75 cups, or 12 75/100 cups. If we look at number 6, we have 5 1/7 inches, but we're going to round our answer to the nearest thousandth. It says, see the resource rounding and estimation if you need a reminder on how to round. So we just did a few examples to remind ourselves how to round, but you also have the rounding and estimation resource in the back of your college level textbook that you can look at for additional resources. So if we have that 5 1/7 and we want to get it to decimal form, I'm going to do 5 plus 1 divided by 7. And you can see that's where we got this number. That's about 5.14285711429, and it keeps going on. And we're going to keep those same unit inches. So if we want to round to the nearest thousandth, we have our tenths place, our hundredths place, and our thousandths place. So that 8 right next to the 2 is telling us to bump it up. So rounded to the nearest thousandth, we have 5.143 inches, or 5 143 thousandths inches. So if we look at number 7, we have 5/9 yards, and we need to round to the nearest hundredth. So I'm going to do 5 divided by 9, which gives us that 0.5 repeating, right? The 5 just keeps going. We have a 6 at the end on our calculator because it's rounding at the very end, but it really is just 5s forever. So one way to write that, if we weren't rounding it, would be to write it as 0.5 with this bar on top of it to tell us that the 5 is repeating. But it helps to kind of write out all those 5s for rounding. We want to round it to the nearest hundredth, which is the second digit after the decimal point. The 5 tells us to bump it up, so it's going to be 0.56 yards, or 56/100ths of a yard. If we look at number 8, we have 15 3/7 gallons. We're going to round to the nearest hundredth. So we're doing 15 plus 3 divided by 7, which gives us this 15.4285714, and it keeps going. We're going to take the 8 and use it to help us round that 2 to the nearest hundredth. The 8 tells us to bump it up, so we have 15.43 gallons. So for number 9, we have 1 1/3 plus 12 4/11 gallons. We're going to round to the nearest thousandth. So what we're going to do is convert each of these numbers to decimals and then add them. One thing I want to point out, and I wrote it down in the note, we're not going to round until our final answer. So I'm going to do 1 plus 1 1/3, which gives us that 1.3 repeating, and 12 plus 4 divided by 11. And that gives us that 12.36 repeating. Notice we can write that with the bar over both the 3 and the 6 because they repeat as a pair. So I'm going to do that 1 point, a whole bunch of 3's, plus 12.36, a whole bunch of those repeating 3 6's. And we get that it's about that 13.696969, right? It keeps repeating. So we're going to round it to the nearest thousandth. That 9 tells us to bump the 6 up, so we have 13.697 gallons, or 13 697 thousandths gallons. If we look at number 10, we're going to do the same thing here, but with subtraction. So we have 7 7/8 minus 3 2/7 quarts. We're going to round to the nearest tenth. So I'm going to do 7 plus 7 divided 8 by 8, which gives us that 7.875. I'm going to do the 3 plus 2 divided by 7, which gives us that about 3.285714286. And I'm going to subtract them. So 7.875 minus 3.285714286, and it gives me about this 4.5892855714. I'm going to round to the nearest tenth, which I know is one digit after my decimal point. The 8 tells me to bump that 5 up, which gives me 4.6 quarts.